Hello, everyone. I think everybody knows me, but for any who don't, my name is Kerry Mould. I'm a retired construction engineer, RCAF, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my deployment to East Timor in the South Pacific, which was from October of 2000 to April 2001. So first of all, where is East Timor? And believe me, when they told me I was going to East Timor, that was the first question I asked, because I'd never heard of it before. So it is a tiny island off the north coast of Australia. It's part of the Indonesian archipelago. Just a quick setup of the island itself. The whole island of Timor is about the same size as Vancouver Island, roughly. It has a population of about 1.2 million. And the capital is the little red square there, Dili. Just from a military point of view, there are only five paved airfields in the whole island, which are shown there. And there is only one port. There are no other places where you can land a ship anywhere on the island except for in the capital of Dili. The road network is poor at best, and it's an extremely mountainous island with a very high interior and very difficult logistics. So just a very quick summary of the history of East Timor. It was one of the Spice Islands. So during the age of exploration, it was discovered by Portugal and was colonized to produce things like coffee and cinnamon and other nutmeg and other spices like that were in great demand in Europe. The island was divided down the middle. One half was Portuguese, which is East Timor, and the other half was Dutch, and that was part of the Dutch East Indies. After World War II, the western half of Timor became part of Indonesia after the Dutch East Indies were given their independence. It was invaded during World War II by the Japanese in 1941, just shortly after Pearl Harbor. And there was an ongoing resistance on the island. The Timorese assisted the Dutch and Australians in fighting the Japanese, and quite a few East Timorese died. And that formed a real bond between the East Timorese and the Australians, because the East Timorese helped and protected a lot of downed pilots, and they also protected the ship spotters that were located on the island that were spotting and reporting on Japanese ship movements. East Timor was part of the Portuguese Empire until 1974. There was a coup d'etat in Portugal, and the new government said, we don't want to be in the colonization business. So you're all free, goodbye. And so they gave them almost no warning that this was going to happen. They had only a couple of months. And one of the key things to understand was that the Portuguese had been running the island pretty much completely. All the government positions, all the administrative positions, all the management and everything were all Portuguese. There were a few half Portuguese, half Timorese in sort of junior positions, but when they declared independence, all the Portuguese went home. They all went back to Portugal. And so that left East Timor basically undefended. And so on the 28th of November, East Timor declared itself independent, an independent country. And about a week later, Indonesia invaded with 35,000 troops. And they declared East Timor part of Indonesia and unified it with West Timor. Starting almost the day that the Indonesians arrived, the East Timorese started a guerrilla war against them. However, unlike guerrilla wars elsewhere in the world, there was no Soviet or Chinese angle to this. So the Americans weren't interested. The Americans weren't interested in supporting it, and there was really very little support that the East Timorese got from anyone else. And the Falantil, which was the the armed wing that was leading the resistance, one of the ways that they determined status within their organization was that there were almost no weapons in East Timor when the Indonesians invaded. So the only source of weapons for the resistance was to take them off of dead Indonesians. And so the more weapons you had recovered for the fight, it was the more status you had. And the head of the Falantil had personally killed 350 or so Indonesians and taken their weapons for the fight. So after the Indonesians took control of East Timor, they started to bring in Indonesian colonists to basically create a ruling class in East Timor over the Timorese. And there was constant fighting. Like the Falantil was attacking farmers, like Indonesian farmers. They were attacking the Indonesian army, because the Indonesian army had like a 30,000 man garrison there, and they were losing like hundreds of guys a month to the resistance. So there was a big push around the world to try and bring an end to this. And so the UN negotiated a plebiscite that they would have a vote in East Timor, and if the locals voted to stay in Indonesia, that would be it. The guerrillas would lay down their arms and become part of Indonesia. This was largely based on false intelligence. The governor of East Timor, not wanting to look weak in Jakarta, had told the government, no problem, we got this thing in the bag, it's going to be 80% voting to join, don't worry. It quickly became obvious that that wasn't going to happen, that the people of East Timor were going to vote to leave. So what did he do? He opened the armories and gave every Indonesian colonist a gun and said, go intimidate the shit out of them. So they started burning houses of East Timorese, like high-profile people, of leaders of the community. They started destroying businesses. It was bad. They had the vote, and despite the intimidation, the Timorese voted 98% to leave and become their own country. Well, that went over like a lead balloon in Indonesia. So the Indonesians changed the orders to their colonists. They said, everything built by Indonesia since 1975, destroy it. They ripped out the entire phone system. They cut all the power lines and took all the power, like all the cables home. They burned bridges, they burned houses, they burned every institution, completely destroyed the country. This was so bad that Australia, who had this long history with the East Timorese, and there were a lot of Australians, especially World War II veterans, who were not happy that Australia had allowed the Indonesians to just take over East Timor. So there was a huge pressure in Australia. So Australia announced it was intervening in East Timor. This was before there was even a UN motion. So the first organization that went to East Timor was called the Intervention Force, or International Force East Timor, INTERFET. And this was a coalition of the willing. And so Australia led it, but they went out to all their friends in the world and asked them to contribute. And one of the people who they asked was Canada, or one of the countries they asked was Canada. And so that led to the establishment of UNTAET, which is the UN Transitional Administration in East Timor. And this is a kind of a unique mission. I think there's only been one other like it, is that the UN didn't just come in to intervene, they came in to run the whole country. Because the key thing was that when the Indonesians did leave, as agreed, but they basically eliminated all the infrastructure, and all of the leadership positions, all of the bureaucracy, everything was all Indonesian. So they all left. So there was nobody to run the government at all. So the UN stepped in to actually run the country for the first 5 years. That was followed after it by UNTAET, which is what David had referred to, which was the mission in support of East Timor. So Canada's mission was called Op-Toucan. And this is a classic Jean Chrétien moment, is that we were quite busy around the world at that time. We had active missions going on in Bosnia and other places. And there was not a lot of spare capacity in the military at the moment to send to East Timor. So the CDS briefed the Prime Minister and said, we can afford to send a company of infantry or 2 Hercs or a support ship. And Chrétien went, he walks out, we're going to send a company of infantry and 2 aircraft and a support ship. So there was some scrambling went on within NDHQ to try and scrounge up how they were going to do this. They ended up only doing a single rotation. And the 3rd Battalion RCR, sorry, the 3rd Battalion Van Duze provided a company, reinforced company with some logistics and stuff added on. They actually got there in time to be part of Interfet. Actually, everybody got there in time to be part of Interfet. The company was the only part that transitioned to be part of UNTAET, and then they left. I'm going to talk a little bit. They built a camp in Zumalai, and I'll show you where that is on the map next. And they also had 3 staff officers in the headquarters of the peacekeeping headquarters. And so after 6 months, D&D said, okay, we've done our thing. We didn't really have the manpower to do this anyway, so we're sending everybody home. But the Minister of Defense from Australia actually made a personal phone call to the Minister of Defense of Canada and said, I understand why you're leaving, yada, 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 but we are extremely short of staff officers, especially Western-trained staff officers in the headquarters. Can you please leave your 3 staff officers that are in the headquarters? So they agreed. So after the main body left, there was another rotation of 3 staff officers. And then I came in as the second rotation of just 3 staff officers. That was the last. We stayed for an extra year after that. So this is just a quick overview of the island. Just to quickly run down, this is a little bit of a flag test. So we have, this is what's called the Akusi Enclave. That was the Jordanians. The main front line here, which is where, like, when the fighting ended, all the rebels went across the border into West Timor and then just like stayed right there. So the front line was manned by the Australians and the New Zealanders. They had a battalion each. In the center of the country, you had a battalion of Filipinos. In and around Dili, you had a battalion of Portuguese, supported by Brazilian military police platoon and 2 squadrons of engineers, one from Pakistan and one from Bangladesh. Then you had, going further to the west, or sorry, to the east, you have a Thai battalion, and at the very tip of the island, you have a South Korean battalion in South Korea's very first peacekeeping mission. And our guys were in Zumalai, which is on the south coast. They were integrated into the New Zealand battalion supporting them. There were a few other small contingents. There was Irish, Kenyan, Fijian, and there was a bunch of ones and twosies, like we'll see later. I worked with a Norwegian who was there by himself. Basically, he was just a one-man contingent. So I was working in Winnipeg at the Air Division as a staff officer in A4AE. And I went on a deployment with Lieutenant Commander Mabit and Lieutenant Navy Rick Trubinsky. We arrived in Darwin, Australia on the 14th of October, and we left on the 23rd of April. And I was in the military information section. And that's kind of its own little thing, is that the UN doesn't have intelligence. That would be aggressive and like would be implying that they were spying on both parties. So they just collect information. They don't do intelligence. We just collect information. In fact, we had a full intelligence cell, and we had several intelligence officers working in our cell. So that's the end of all the written stuff, and I'll get into some pictures, and I'll give you a little rundown of where we were and what it was like. So I was stationed in Dili, which is the capital. It's about 220,000 people. It is about the only flat land in the whole island. You can see here, like we're in the mountains looking back. It was covered with a constant haze of wood smoke because the Indonesians had destroyed all the infrastructure, and so people were resorting to using fire to cook their meals and to heat their homes. They did have power by the time I got there. They had brought in 3 or 4 locomotives, and they had brought them in by ship, laid down a short bit of track, got them off the ship, and parked them, and they used them for generators to power the city. Our power was very, very unstable for the whole time I was there until the UN got its own generators and took all of the UN facilities off of central power because we were by far the major consumer of power. Just to give you an idea, these are the sort of housing that in the area immediately next to where I was stationed. Definitely poor. East Timor is the 6th poorest country in the world. Their average income, so average GDP is about $1,400 a year, but the average person makes less than $1 a day. And one of the things that the UN did to try and help that was whenever we had a major project, we wouldn't bring in heavy equipment. We'd put out a call and we would hire as many East Timorese that showed up at $1 a day, and they had to bring their own shovel. And so, for example, they were digging a water line. They hired like 3,000 people, and they just dug the water line by hand because that meant $3,000 into the pockets of East Timorese for that day's work. Also, I showed the picture on the bottom. That's the main river that runs through Dili. It doesn't exist for 9 months of the year, but in the rainy season, it becomes an absolute torrent. And that was one of the things that I was shocked with is you're there in the dry season, and there's just empty riverbeds and everything like that. When the rainy season started, it was unbelievable. There's some pictures I took while I was out in the countryside. You have the more traditional accommodation, dirt-floored huts. The people who lived there were very simple, practically medieval in technology. It's a very Catholic country because it had been Portuguese. They're very Catholic. Open air markets and that were the main way people bought stuff. That's me in Idu, I think it is, where I went out to visit some of the Falentil rebels. This is where I worked. So this was part of what I would call like a technical college that had been built by the Indonesians. So of course, when they left, they burned it. So the building, so this is our security checkpoint here. This building behind, it was completely gutted. There was nothing in it, it was all burned. But the one small building, the 3-story building behind it, had survived. So that's where our headquarters was, in that small 3-story building. Then the ditch here, that was one of the things I was saying, is when the water came, when the rains came, they came like amazing amount. So every road was matched by a pair of ditches, one on either side, about 5 feet wide and about 5 feet deep. And when the rains came, they were absolutely full to the top and rocketing downhill. And then our accommodation at the bottom there, we were in what we called Kobe huts. These were temporary buildings that had been put up in Kobe, Japan after the earthquake. And once the people were back into their regular homes, Japan donated all these Kobe huts to the UN to set up our accommodations in. They're actually quite comfortable. We had good accommodations. The road situation in East Timor was pretty dire. Under the Portuguese and then even under the Indonesians, every spring they would have gangs of workers that would go out and clear out all the ditches because, like I mentioned, all the water caused huge amounts of erosion. When after the fighting broke out, that work stopped, and then after the transition to the UN, there was no highways department or anything like that, so no one did any road maintenance, and it very quickly showed 1 or 2 rainy seasons and roads were completely knocked out. And just a little indication of the Venga buses there. We had lots of people, there was lots of deaths from traffic accidents. We had one bus accident that killed like 50 people. I got a chance to travel as part of the UN, traveling around to the different parts of the country, which was definitely interesting. You see the much higher quality of houses or buildings that the UN was in. These were mostly built by the Portuguese in the 50s and 60s. They had like a lot of like plantation style houses and stuff like that. And then at the bottom there we had a visit by our military attaché from Indonesia, and we borrowed the Canadian Land Rover to travel around. We weren't the only Canadians there. There were a large contingent from Elections Canada and quite a few RCMP officers there as well with the CIVPOL contingent. Had lots of fun interacting with all of the locals. The kids were great. The Indonesians were, the East Timorese were amazing people, very, very friendly. They really, were looking at the best of things. They were looking at, they'd achieved their independence and it was going forward, it's going to be good. Just by way of seeing how poor they are, this picture in the bottom left corner, that's a school for 400 children. They did schooling by shifts. They'd have like 4 shifts a day. And they were just in a few sticks with a tarp over top of it. And they were, we were there looking at ways that we could help them and provide funding for that sort of stuff. I also got a chance to travel down to Akusi. So Akusi is an enclave. So it's in West Timor, but ethnically they are Timorese, not Indonesians. So it is part of East Timor. You can only get there by air or by sea. And we happened to travel in the rainy season. So you can see the flooding. They have a lot of rice fields there. So during the rainy season, they flood the rice fields to bring in extra nutrients and stuff like that. I got a chance to travel with the deputy commander, who was Australian. It was interesting. The commander of the mission was a Thai. The deputy commander was always, well, the commander changed. It was a Thai while I was there, but the deputy commander was always Australian. And at every meeting, somebody would say something, and everyone would look to the deputy commander to nod. If he nodded, then yeah, we were doing it. So, as I mentioned, we were there with other Canadians. So there was 3 RCMP guys who were there as part of the UN CIVPOL mission. There was also a bunch of people there from Elections Canada. One little story for you about the Elections Canada folks. They had a unique challenge, is that 93% of East Timorese are illiterate. So how do you do a democratic ballot? So what they came up with was when they had the vote, they would have all the candidates sit at a long table, and in front of each candidate would be a fruit. So this guy had a banana, this guy had an apple, this guy had a pineapple, this guy had an orange, and on the ballots there would be the name and then the fruit there, and you made your X beside the fruit of the guy that you wanted to vote for. So, and they had very high turnout. People were very excited about being able to vote and participate. So I worked in the military information cell. We were a very multinational group. We had a Norwegian, myself, 2 Australians, 2 New Zealanders, 2 Jordanians, 2 Thais, 2 Portuguese. And we were led by Colonel Oliveira, who is a Portuguese cavalry officer. Enough said about that. So the big thing that I found really exciting about being there was we were there at the birth of a nation. So the transitional administration was there basically as a caretaker to help the East Timorese set up their own country. And this is me with Xanana Gusmao, who was the first president of East Timor. I got to know him and some of his chief of defense staff and several other members of his government as part of my job within the political intelligence group. We did interviews. So one of the things, I brought a few show and tell things here, and one of the things that I did was the East Timor Political Handbook. And for a very, very small country, they had a lot of political parties. And so what we did was we put together this book that outlined who the political parties were, where their base of support was, what their political positions were. I interviewed a lot of their political leadership. It was really interesting. There was one family who had 12 kids, I think, and 4 sons each started their own political party. So they all were competing with each other. I said, you know, it must be really interesting at Christmas time or Easter, and you're sitting down for dinner with 4 different political parties. That being said, Fretlin, which was the political party that had declared independence in 1975, they were by far the largest. And in the first round of elections, they won every single seat. And that was Xanana Gusmao's party. He spent many years in jail. A lot of people equate him to like Nelson Mandela. He spent many years in jail with the Indonesians. When he got out of jail, he spent many years in Australia campaigning for the freedom of East Timor, and he ended up being the first president. So I didn't want to go too long, so that's the end of the show, but some of the other things, we produced a Indonesian security forces and a militia handbook, which outlined the different groups there, and then I brought a couple of the East Timor handbook, which is more of a geographical, political thing, and the Interfet handbook, which was produced by the Australians, which has a lot of really good detail on the Indonesian people, the East Timorese people, and the political background behind the fight.